Okay. No. Everybody. I wrote on the top of my notes, start Zoom, because if I don't, I will forget. So we have a couple people on Zoom tonight, and I'm sorry that my back is turned to our Zoom people. But we'll fix that in a moment. And we are recording this via the camera and laptop tonight, just to let everyone know. But welcome. I have a couple of events to highlight that are coming up very soon. April 27th is Independent Bookstore Day, which is always a big celebration around here. We will have some sales, we will have some giveaways, we will have exclusive items for sale, and there is a rumor that there will be cake at some point. So I pretty much planned my whole weekend around cake, so there you go. And that weekend, we will also be selling books, so that especially that Saturday, the 27th, we will be at the Southern Adirondack Homesteading Festival, which is at the Washington County Fairgrounds. And we will be there to sell books for their keynote speaker, Jill Winger. She is the author of the Prairie Homestead Cookbook. So there's lots going on that weekend. And then I wanted to also mention, because this is especially exciting for us, on Tuesday, May 14th, it's a 4-hour stand from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. We will welcome author and Adirondack Raptors founder, Mark Mansky, along with his Eurasian eagle owl, whose name is Morley, to the store. We had scheduled Mark for almost exactly a year ago, and he had some ill health and wasn't able to make it. I had all these school groups lined up and had to cancel everybody. So we're super happy to have Mark back. We've rescheduled all the school groups, but anybody is welcome to come during that 4-hour span. So it's on May 14th. All right. It is my pleasure to introduce Joseph Bruchac to you tonight. A citizen of the Nulhegan Abenaki Nation, Joseph Bruchac has authored more than 180 books in numerous genres, and his poems, fiction, and essays have appeared in hundreds of publications, including the American Poetry Review, the Yellow Medicine Review, Parabola, National Geographic, and Highlights for Children. He is the winner of many awards, including a National Endowment for the Arts Writing Fellowship and a Rockefeller Humanities Fellowship. Some of his notable works include Keepers of the Earth and Code Talker, which was selected by Time Magazine as one of the 100 best young adult books of all time. In addition, he's the 2023-24 Poet Laureate of Saratoga Springs, New York. We're very pleased. We're launching Dawnland tonight, Joe's new book. Joe's written so many books, it's hard to bring them all into the store for one night, but we have a selection of them there on the table behind us. We have Dawnland. Also, if you haven't had a chance to pick up a copy of Voices of the People, I encourage you to do so. It's amazing, and the contemporary art in there is phenomenal. So that's it for me. Please join me in welcoming Joe Bruchac back to Batten Hill Books. Welcome. Thank you.
Why, Nito Mark. Hello, my friends. Louise Souza, my name is Joseph for the peaceful one. And I Saratoga, on Louison Beach. I love Saratoga where the medicines take place. Hello, Bania, human being is what I am, Takia, as are all of you. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, to open with the voice of the flute. The flute is the wind, it is the trees, it is the birds. And it is the breath that binds us all together. We're all breathing that same air. We're all sharing the same rhythm of the heart. We're all connected together. Where we're from is the earth, all of us. where we also will return. And so to hear the sound of the flute, that music of breath, reminds us of that ancient connection that is always going to be there all around us. That particular song that I just played, the first one, I just made it up as I went along, just to see what breathe in and breathe out would produce. And that one I just played is called Tutuaz. It's about the little pine trees, how the big trees grow in the forest, they spread out their boughs, and the little trees grow up beneath them and are protected by the great, great grown-up trees, just as our children are protected by those of us in the older generations. That song is known among all the different Abenaki nations of what we call the Dawn Land. That is New England, the area all the way from the maritime provinces of Canada through what we now call Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and all the way up into the Adirondack Mountains is the traditional homeland of our Abenaki people. Abenaki means dawn land. Ki is earth, Waban, Oban is dawn. And thus it is that this novel of mine is called Dawnland. It takes place a long time ago. And if you read the novel, you'll notice that you don't find the mention of things like days or years or time or any of those things that are part of modern culture. Indeed, I tried in the language of this book to replicate what it would be if I changed the Abenaki language into the English language and told that story. And I'm going to read a couple of sections from the book, then make a couple of remarks about it. And it begins in the time called the moon of changing leaves, which is, of course, what we call autumn, the time when the leaves are falling. Instead of talking about months of the year, we would talk about the moons of the sky. Right now, it's the moon of maple syrup, the moon of the flowing of the maple trees. Soon it will be the moon of planting, then the moon of strawberries, and so on, throughout those 13 moons of any given year. And the story begins in the moon of changing leaves. My main character's name is Young Hunter. Before dawn, Kita, Noda, listen, hear me. So it begins. By the way, listening is a very powerful thing. We all have 2 ears and only 1 mouth. We're supposed to listen twice as much as we talk. And in many of our different indigenous traditions around the continent, my own Abenaki people, the Hopi people of the Southwest, the Kalalam people of the Northwest, all around this continent, often when we tell stories, we begin by saying something like, listen, listen, or hear me. And those who are listening, if I say, ho, then the listeners would say, hey, and we're trying to, ho,
Hey,
ho.
hey.
See, that connects us together. That makes that circle strong. He built the fire before the sun rose. He sat naked in front of it, watching the glow of the stones within its heart. There were 13 stones, one for each of the villages of the people of the Dawnland. Behind him was the door of the lodge open to the east. Beside him was the knife he had napped from the hillside flint the day before, using the one implement he carried with him for his task. That one tool, a piece of deer antler, the length of the span from stretched out thumb to the end of his middle finger, rested in the hollow of a tree near the flint hill place a look away. He had brought nothing with him to this place that was not of his own making. That which was most his own, which he would soon offer strongly, as the only people taught, was his body. That little paragraph has a lot of our tradition in it. For example, distance was not measured by miles or kilometers. It was mentioned by looks. Something is 3 looks away. Okay, I see as far as there, I walk to there, and then I see as far as there and walk to there. And sometimes a look is a lot longer. If you're on a mountaintop, your look is a long look, but that distance is relating to the natural world and our presence and our movement across it. I also mentioned that he had made something with a deer antler, which is used to chip or to flake flint through hard pressure, flakes away, and eventually creates a sharp implement. I should say that when I talk about something like making a fire or making a tool or tracking an animal, these are all things I have done personally. I'm not talking about them in the abstract. I'm talking about things that I've experienced and that I have done in that way of measuring how far something is. Again, not by feet, not by inches, by the use of the hand. Well, the foot, which was the original word that foot came from. But of course, that is a natural way to do things. And behind it is a lodge, which is a sweat lodge. We would make a shape like a geodesic dome, like an umbrella. And inside that, covered with bark or covered with animal skins, or these days with blankets, one open door, which would be closed, it would be all dark. In the center of that sweat lodge, we place heated stones. Then pouring water over them, creating steam, would be like a sauna, means of cleansing your body, but also clearing your mind and your spirit for a task you have ahead of you. Behind him, the door of the lodge was open. The lodge was small, height of a man's waist. It was shaped like the sky dome. Shaped the sky dome, a native perception of the world. The 12 peeled willow saplings that formed its frame were those he had cut and peeled the afternoon before, sharpened and pressed into the soft earth, tied together with the thin, tough roots of the thin, tough roots of the woodbine and the grapevine, which grew here in profusion. And of course, that description of something 12 is a very important number. 12 is a multiple of 4. 4 is a powerful number, the 4 directions. The 2 grandmothers and 2 grandfathers we all have. And way that I was taught is that there are 4 things we need to remember. 1, listen, which I mentioned. 2, observe with our 2 eyes. 3, remember. And 4th, to share. And through my memory, I am sharing as I wrote this book. And by the way, I should say that the writing of this book was not something that I did really consciously. I didn't plan it. I didn't outline it. I just told the story as it came to me. I let the story tell itself. And often I did not know where the story was going to go. I simply followed my main character, young Hunter, as he walked along, as things happened to him. Here as an example of something that happened to him. Young Hunter described going to the place where the deer would pass, lying and waiting until dawn. By the way, the hunting of the deer, and I described that in here, the traditional way for a young man to take his first deer, a deer that was done in the old way, would be to take no weapons, nothing with him. The young woman might do this as well. And to pursue a certain deer, you would choose the deer ahead of time. You knew all the deer in your forest. You didn't just choose one at random. You might choose a deer that was a 4-year-old doe that had no fawns. So by taking her, you're not taking away from the continuance of life. You wouldn't take a buck because it is fathering new ones to come, or a female deer with young ones. No, those would not be touched. And then you would make that deer run and keep it running by walking behind it constantly. And sometimes it would take days until eventually the deer would run no further. And then you would put your hand over its mouth and its nose until it slept. And you'd carry that deer, that dead animal, which was not dead, because we would say when an animal dies like this, it's only its body that has died. We would say in the Abenaki language, may you continue to run. We say to a fish, may you continue to swim. To a squirrel, may you continue to climb, because all that has been taken is just this body, but the breath and the spirit continue on. It's all connected together. So this is what he's embarking upon, but something happens to him. As he took his first step to follow the chosen deer, he knew something strange was going to happen. And when the chosen deer ran, A 3 winters doe that had no fawn, she ran straight. She did not circle as another deer might. He could not cut her trail. She was going someplace faster than he had expected. Late in the day, as he crossed a rocky place with a doe not far ahead, he found the brave one. The brave one. Do you know who the brave one is? I will tell you. It is our word for the rattlesnake. Because a rattlesnake always warns you before it strikes. It is, we say, a warrior who does not strike from hiding. It says, here I am, don't step on me. But in this case, young hunter did not stop soon enough. His foot came down on it as he followed the deer that had stopped and was looking back at him. It was too late to pull his foot back. The head came around lazily, fangs extended to punch into the flesh of his calf. It struck and let go, and his eyes held his as it slipped back into a coil, its rattle singing the warning song, too late. So he's struck by a rattlesnake at the very start of the story, but he continues on because he knows what to do when something like that happens. I won't say more about that, just to give you a little taste of that. Another thing too, is that if you look at a character like the character in my story, what is it that makes this character like this? What is it that gives him that kind of personality? And I go back in time to when he was a child. And the stories he learned might delight or frighten the children, but they also taught lessons. Like the story of the old woman with a sweet voice who hides in the swamps and drowns the children foolish enough to venture in alone. It was a good story to keep most of the children out of the dangerous places, although such stories did not always work. By the way, we say that the best way to get a child to do something is to say, don't do that. Instead of saying, don't do it, we would tell a lesson story to show the rewards of good behavior, the consequences of bad behavior. And the story of the woman in the swamp, of Toad Woman, as we call her, is one of the stories we use to convince children not to go into dangerous places like swamps. Except that it was a good story to keep most of the children out of those dangerous places, although such stories did not always work. Young Hunter smiled. He remembered the morning when his grandmother had found her 7 winters old grandson. By the way, winters old, not years. We don't talk in terms of years. If you've lived through a winter, you've lived through a cycle of the seasons. So I am now 81 winters old. And that's my age, as opposed to 81 years. Young Hunter smiled. He remembered the morning when his grandmother found her 7 winters old grandson setting out toward the swamp. Over his shoulder, he carried a pole he had fashioned into a spear, sharpening its tip with his small knife and then hardening it in the fire. You are walking far, grandson, his grandmother said. I go to the swamp, grandmother. Uh-huh. By the way, I'll teach you how to say yes in Abenaki. Try this. Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
Very good. Very good. Try not to forget. By the way, I think that's a loan word from indigenous languages into English because it became quickly part of the American dialect of American English. Now world dialect. Uh-huh is the old way of saying yes, the Abenaki language. And what about the old woman who waits there to drown the children? It is all right, grandmother. That is why I'm going to the swamp. I'm going to find her and kill her with my spear. Then she will trouble the people no longer. Neither his grandmother or his grandfather, whose attention during this conversation was focused on a very interesting piece of bark on the wall of their lodge, told young Hunter not to go into the swamp. But as the boy vanished along the trail, a significant glance passed between the old people. When young Hunter came back, worn out and covered with mud, almost frozen at the end of the day, neither of his grandparents said anything to him. His grandfather was leaning against the side of the lodge, his head back, his eyes closed, breathing hard as if he had just come running from somewhere. Young Hunter looked at him intently, but the old man said nothing. So there is that tradition of letting your children do what they wish to do, but also keeping an eye on them. My own 2 sons are grown now. My son Jim is a professional animal tracker and outdoor educator. My son Jesse teaches our language and is in charge of the School of Etiquette at Middlebury College, Middlebury University. And when they were kids, they could go in the swamp, they could go in the woods, they could go anywhere they wanted. I wouldn't stop them, but I would follow them and tried to keep out of sight. Although one day when my son Jesse was 12 years old, he was walking through the forest with some friends. One of them said, "Oh my gosh, what's that?" And Jesse said, "Don't pay any attention, it's my father up in that tree." He caught me watching it, see what they're going to do. Another aspect of this story is that young Hunter has 3 dogs who travel with him everywhere. And dogs are very important in our indigenous traditions. We say that when the earth was new, and I'll tell the story in here, the animals were very big and they were very dangerous, some of them. So the one we call Glus, who was a man of great power, the first one in the shape of a human being, called the animals together and asked what they do. He said to the bear, "What will you do when you see a human being?" And the bear said, "I will swallow it." And Glus thought, I don't think human beings will enjoy being swallowed by bears. So he made the bear smaller. He did the same thing with other animals, like the moose. Rounded its horns, pressed it down. In fact, he pressed so hard his nose got all flat. The moose still has a flat nose to this day. Finally, only one animal was left, sitting in the middle of the clearing, wagging its tail. It was dog. And when Glus said, "Are you going to do something to hurt the people?" The dog said, "No, I want to be their best friend and go with them everywhere. I want to play with their children and help them hunt. I want to be their best friend." And Glus said, "You will indeed be a better friend than some of them deserve. And so you will be known as Alamos, the one who walks beside us." The young Hunter's 3 dogs. One of them has just been injured. And young Hunter is talking to them. He looked around and found the stick, no bigger around than his small finger and the length of his arm, like his pole that had been stripped clean by a beaver. There were gull feathers floating on the surface of the water. He picked up the stick and 4 of the feathers. With a small piece of sinew, he bound the feathers to the end of the stick, then carefully wedged the other end in a crack in the stone to step back. The wind fluttered the feathers at the end of the stick. It made him think of a prayer. By the way, that is an old way of making a prayer, to fasten feathers to a stick. I have friends who are actually California native people and Miwok, and every year they climb Mount Shasta and they put a pole with feathers on it on top of the mountain. It's a prayer. My character does this. His dogs were waiting patiently in the boat. Agwejaman and Tanoa sat with their heads up and alert, looking in different directions. Babechiman straightened himself on his side and looked guilty. "So," the Hunter said, "you were thinking of chewing at the sinew that holds your belly together. You've been wounded and bound it back together. Is that not so?" The dog put his paws over his eyes. "You are a bad one. I should throw you in the lake." Babechiman pressed his paws even more tightly over his eyes and whimpered. "Miserable one," young Hunter said. He reached out his hand and stroked the dog's head. "You are a good friend. You fought to save my life. Now I ask you just this, allow yourself to heal. Do you hear me, Nitomba? Lick your wound, but do not chew at it." Babejiman licked his hand and then lay back. That little interchange between that person and that animal person, which is how we refer to the animals, animal people, is emblematic of the indigenous relationship with animals and also the relationship many of us have with dogs, no matter what our background is, because the dog is indeed the best companion that human beings have. In fact, several people told me I should have named this book Dogland because the dogs are so important throughout the book. There's another thing in the story that I won't go into. I'm not going to read a lot of it. I'm just going to give you a few little hints of things. But there's a character in here who is sort of an antagonist, who goes through a transformation within the story. We say in many of our indigenous traditions, probably all of them, that there are 2 ways we can be thinking. We can be thinking clearly, good thoughts, thoughts that are kind, thoughts that are positive, thoughts that are helpful, and thoughts that are kind to ourselves as well, not being self-pitying or doing things that, indicate you feel like you've been given a bad deal with life. There's a lot of that going on. That's the good mind. Then there's what we call the twisted mind. This in American Indian Sign Language means anger. Your mind is twisting back on itself. It's not straight. And you can look at yourself and say, how am I thinking right now? Am I in the good mind? Am I in the twisted mind? And you can change your mind. You can change your mind. And there is an instance of that in this book, of someone literally changing their mind. Although it's not the story I'm telling here, I have a novel there called The Peacemaker and another book called The Peacemaker for Warring Nations that tells the story of the founding of the Haudenosaunee League, the League of the Iroquois. And in that story, there's a period when all the Haudenosaunee nations, the 5 original Iroquois nations, are fighting each other constantly. And murder and, captivity and terrible things are common everywhere. And so the creator, Diesel, the holder up of the heavens, as the Mohawk call that one, sends a peace messenger who travels around from nation to nation, talking about the importance of peace. And people literally change their minds and agree to be peaceful. And the worst character in the book is the leader of the Onondaga Nation, Padanaho, who is so twisted with evil thoughts and selfishness and violence that his body is crooked in 7 places. And he has snakes growing out of his hair. And when they tell him, when they sing to him a song of peace, he cannot move. Then they comb the snakes of his hair and straighten him up. It straightens his mind. And he becomes the leader of that league of the Haudenosaunee. It's like as if instead of killing Saddam Hussein, he became the head of the United Nations and spoke for peace. That idea that even an evil person or a person who has done evil can change. There's no one who's born evil. We're all born with the same gift of life from the Creator. And that's one of the things I try to bring forward in the stories in this book, because it's made up actually of many stories and one story. The main character goes through here, encountering different people off on this quest to face an ancient evil, an ancient danger to his people. He encounters many, many instances where he is taught a lesson, and it's always based on traditional stories. I have to tell you something that's kind of funny though. When I wrote this book, I thought I was making up some of the stories because I didn't think I'd ever heard them before. And then when a couple of my elders, for example, Madawi Lasses, Maurice Dennis, who's an Abenaki elder, who for years worked in a place called the Enchanted Forest and created the Indian village up there, wonderful person. He said, Joe, I'm so glad you included that old story. And he mentioned, I said, that's an old story? Said, oh yeah, that's a very old story. But I thought I'd made it up. Maybe I'd heard it somewhere, or maybe it just decided to give itself to me. That can happen. Things can come to you, including new ideas that are not new, and old ideas that are repeating themselves for the first time to you. I have a very dear friend who passed away just a few years ago, named Kevin Locke. Kevin was a Lakota flute player, folk dancer, and storyteller. And Kevin told me that many years ago, he was going to perform at the Squawky Reservation in Iowa, the Squawky community, not a reservation. They bought their own land and they own their own land. This was a period of the 1800s and it is their land. And he was out walking in the field around the community and the wind began to blow and he began to hear a flute song he had never heard before, just on the wind. No one was playing it. It was a song in the wind and in the branches of the trees. He listened closely and began to play that song. And when he finished, he said, a new song. And he went back and he did his program that night and he played that song without saying where he got it. And when the program was over, an old woman came up to him and said, I'm so glad to hear that song again. I haven't heard it since I was a child. I didn't know anybody remembered it. Kevin said, there's a gift. There, indeed, is a gift. Thinking of gifts, whenever you read, you are returning a gift. Whenever you read something yourself, you are being given a gift by the book that you read. And you may return that gift in other ways by passing things on to other people. The importance of passing things on. It's one of the reasons why I write. I became a writer because I love words, I love poetry, I love language, I love storytelling. I love sharing the stories that I've heard or that I've just made up perhaps with others. And also, although my ancestry is mixed, I'm very proud of the Slovak side of my family. I've written about it and would never hide it or change my name, Bruchac, which by the way means bear person in Slovak. Yeah, my Slovak grandmother used to say, Joseph, we Slovaks, we are the Indians of Europe. We are the people of the forest. You'll never forget that. I said, okay, grandma. But I know. But that idea that we are of the land, that we are people of the land is an indigenous idea for all people. We're all indigenous if we remember it, where we are from and what we are from connects us to the earth in the long run. And that connection is something we should never forget. But as I said, although I'm proud of that Slovak side, I also have the Beneki side. And I knew very little about it as a kid. People kept it quiet. It was dangerous to be labeled as a Beneki. In Vermont, there was a eugenics project sterilizing people in the 1930s and 40s. And a lot of Beneki people were identified and sterilized. And also, there's a long history of Native people here in the Adirondacks, a little to the north. Very few people talk about this or know it. I'm working now on a book about the indigenous heritage of the Adirondacks with my son, Jesse. But there are numerous cases of Native people who were murdered and no one was ever convicted for anything. Often they were hunters and trappers in the forest. Never anyone was prosecuted for their murders. So it was dangerous to be identified as Native. In fact, one of the guides that used to be up at the Gully Club in Indian Lake where my father and I used to hunt, a really wonderful guy, a great man, elder, really knows so many things. And I didn't know it, but he was a Beneki. And I found out when I went to a powwow, and there his nephew and his niece and his grandson, all dressed in regalia and selling the things they made. They go, oh yeah, Uncle so-and-so, he's a Beneki, but being quiet about it was important. So as a result, a lot of things weren't told, a lot of stories were not told, and we had a lot of prejudice in this country. Still there's racial prejudice against people who were brown skinned or different. And so when I was a kid, there were no books that had positive images of indigenous people. And the closest was The Last of the Mohicans, where there were good Indians and bad Indians. But the good Indians were the last of their tribe, and there weren't no more Mohicans. By the way, the last of the Mohicans has not yet been born. I got a lot of Mohican friends. So I decided that when I wrote, I would tell those stories for young people and for my own children that I had never heard. The stories I had never heard would be part of what I would write and pass on to make sure the new generations had the opportunity to hear those stories, to identify with them, whether they're indigenous or not. When you read a book by another person, you find yourself identifying with that character and beginning to feel as if you're living a bit of their life. That is a wonderful thing, that empathy that we can share, that we can experience through reading is something I'm deeply inspired by and will always defend. The importance of places like this bookstore, the importance of libraries, the importance of classrooms where free discourse and discussion is allowed. And I can tell you, some of my books have been banned in schools. A book of mine called Keepers of the Earth was banned in Christian schools because Pat Robertson on the 700 Club on TV years ago said, this is a bad book because it will teach your children to worship Mother Earth instead of Father God. And, a friend of mine saw that on TV. He was a Blackfeet folk singer and storyteller named Jack Gladstone. And Jack said, when he saw that on the TV, he walked over, put his hand on the television and said, "Be healed, Pat, it is a metaphor." But, so I'm a very strong believer and defender of the freedom of literature and the importance of places such as this place where we sit right now. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? We'd be glad to try to answer.
What got you started as a writer?
What got me started as a writer was reading. My grandmother had books everywhere. My grandfather could not read or write. He had been the hired man of her family. And when they got married, it was a huge scandal. My grandmother, who was well educated, marrying this brown skinned native man who was the hired man. But he knew everything about the words and so many things and always encouraged me. And as I read, I would memorize poems. I would try to write poems myself. And as a second grader, I was writing poems for my teacher and getting in trouble with the other kids because I was a teacher's pet. They beat me up after school, like I often say, my first experience with hostile literary critics. But I continued writing. I wanted to write about nature. I've always had a strong connection to the natural world, certainly through my grandfather, but through living in Greenfield Center with woods all around me. And so I was going to be a naturalist. I went to Cornell University majoring in wildlife conservation. And I was already writing. I was writing about nature and writing a lot of things at the time. I took a creative writing course. And this is a funny story. I was the varsity heavyweight wrestler at Cornell. And when I walked into that creative writing classroom, I was carrying my gym bag and I had a short haircut, and Matt Burns, and my ear was swollen up from a cauliflower ear. And the teacher took one look at me and said, "You're in the wrong place. You can leave and drop this class." "No, I really want to be here. I want to write." "Well, you can always drop it." And he kept encouraging me to drop the class for the first few weeks until I wrote something he liked. They said, "You really can write. You wrote this?" I said, "No." When my first book of poetry was published, this man, David Ray, a well-published poet, wrote a blurb on the back, which was published on the back of the book. "Joe Bruchac used to be a championship wrestler. Now he's a championship writer." I often tell that story to kids to say, don't get discouraged. Don't let someone look at you and say, "You can't do this because of the way you look, because of who you are. You're not the one to do this." Never let anyone judge you by your outward appearance. What is in your mind and in your heart? And in my case, it was first poetry and then storytelling. Then eventually I branched out. I've written virtually every genre you can imagine. Science fiction, screenplays, plays, horror, fantasy, historical novels. One of my new books over there is called Of All Tribes. It's a nonfiction story of the Indian takeover of Alcatraz. Another of my books, Voices of the People, are biographical poems about indigenous people of the last 1,000 years who should be known. And the cool thing about that book, and it's so cheap for what they did, so it's like a coffee table book,
Amazing.
is that we contacted contemporary Native artists and they agreed to contribute. So every poem has a work of Native art facing, which is really, really nice. And so I've written in all kinds of genres, and I love the novel, especially the novel that draws on tradition, history, and culture. My novel Code Talker was done with the help of Navajo code talkers themselves, who shared their stories, who read everything I wrote and made sure I didn't make mistakes. And in telling that story, I was telling their story through the words of a character based on a number of Navajo men who were code talkers I knew. So for me, writing is a journey, and every book is a different journey. And this book is a real journey. My character, Young Hunter, takes a long journey to face a danger that is coming to endanger the lives of his people. And it can be seen also as a kind of metaphor for contemporary times. There are a lot of things that are happening in the world today that we need to confront and find a way to relate to. And it's not always through violence. It's not always through conflict. Sometimes it's a way of changing a mind rather than destroying an enemy. Any other questions?
Any advice you have for someone who's, let's see, senior citizen just beginning to get out there writing?
I'll tell you a story. I was in Oklahoma 30 years ago doing a writing workshop with a friend of mine, Lance Henson, who's a Cheyenne poet, who wanted to be here tonight. I just had him in schools all week, but he had to leave today. And Lance and I did this writing workshop, and this elderly man in his 70s came to this workshop. Lewis Little Coon Oliver, elderly Muskogee Creek man. And after our poetry reading, he came up and said, I really like that newfangled poetry of yours. It doesn't have to rhyme like that Sheets and Kelly guys, Keith and Shelley. And he said, I think I'm going to try my hand at that. Well, he said, please do, Lewis, and anything you write, send it to us. So he got copies of all our books. He began reading contemporary native writing. This is back in the 1980s. And he started sending me poems. Every week I get a thick envelope full of his original poems. They got better and better and better. And eventually we put together a book of them and it was published. Then we published another book of his. Then a third book of his was published by another publisher. By the time he was 82 years old, he had 4 books published and he had been published and translated into 24 languages. And this was starting at the age of the mid-70s. He said, before I met you folks, I was ready to, like an old woodchuck, just crawl into my hole and pull it in after me. But then when I saw there was folks that had actually listened to me, I'd give it a try. He was an eloquent writer and a really good writer, very dear friend. So that's a story I tell people. Just because you're of a certain age doesn't mean your words are old. Just means you bring a little more knowledge, a little more of your journey to those words. And I can think of numerous cases where that has happened. I published a book by an elderly Cherokee writer and called Boston Mountain Tales. He was 78 when it was published. He won an award for the best new book of the year by a native writer, which was offered to an organization I was involved in. And when I called him up, he said, I can't talk because I'm crying so hard. But that idea that anyone at any stage in your life, as long as you're still able to think and express yourself, you could and might write something that others will want to read. But if you don't try, it won't happen. I always tell people there's only 2 things you need to do to be a writer. One is write. Don't talk about writing. Don't think about writing. Don't plan your writing. Don't say, next week I'm going to write. I'll put some time aside after I cleaned off my desk. Oh, look, what a beautiful day it is. I'll just take a little walk. Oh, time to go to bed. Write regularly, every day. A little bit every day. A page a day. That's 365 pages in a year. Second thing, rewrite. Because if you want anyone to read what you write, you got to rewrite it. To be a writer, you got to write. To be read, you got to rewrite. And don't think it's perfect the first time. And that idea of rewriting, when I was at Syracuse University, I had a teacher named W.D. Snodgrass, who was a pretty well-known American poet. And what D said he did was he would write a poem, and he had this drawer, and he'd open the drawer in the desk, he'd put the poem in there, shut the door, and lock that drawer, and not open it for a week. And then when he took it out a week later and pulled out the poem, say, I wonder who wrote this, see if they're any good. And he'd read that poem we hadn't seen for a week. He said, sometimes you just put it in the round drawer on the floor, but other times it's not bad, but it needs some work. And then he'd do a revision and put the revision back in the magic drawer and close it. And that idea of giving yourself time with your work, but also time away from your work, can get too close to it and you can't see what you're doing. So anytime I write something, the next day I read what I wrote, see if it sounds any good to me. And then I continue as a novel from that point on. And sometimes when I'm writing, I'll write a page. When I'm working on a big book, like a novel, I'll try to write every day. And some days I'll write 30 pages. I wrote a novel called Skeleton Man, which is a young middle grade novel. And I woke up hearing the main character's voice in my head and sat down and began to write. Like this here, I literally saw my main character doing these things and was describing his journey as much as anything else. I felt like I was watching a movie and, saying what was happening in that film. And so I sat down in the morning and started to write on my computer. And my wife came in the room and said, "Joe, aren't you hungry?" I said, "No, I don't need breakfast." She said, "Darling, it's 6 p.m. talking about dinner." I had written 80 pages of that little novel, and I finished my first draft in 1 week. But then I went back and did extensive rewriting for a much longer period. But I was hearing the main character tell her story. Just like in this one, I told it in first person voice. This is third person, as I'm watching all the characters, which enables me to go to different perspectives and see different places and different things other than just what is happening with my main character. That's one of the great things about third person narrative. You can move around, but also first person. I find it also is a perspective that draws the reader in, and the reader can feel very much part of that woman, that man, that human being, that animal, that narrative, whoever it is that's telling that story. And you can become part of their life, the telling. And I hope that my third person narrative here, which is not omniscient, but it knows what my characters know. It knows this culture. It doesn't know everything. Will draw you in. And like I tell stories, like here's a story called The Faithful Dogs. There was a hunter who always treated his dogs well, gave them food before he ate. They slept with him in his lodge. He petted them and spoke kindly to them often. They were always gentle with him, but when they hunted, they were fierce. There were 4 dogs. One of them was white as the new snow. One was black as the night without moon or stars. One was brown as the earth at planting time. The last dog, which was the leader dog, was gray. It had 2 spots like another pair of eyes on his forehead. Together, the 4 dogs could kill me with a full-grown bear. And that dog with the 2 spots over his eyes is a tradition that a dog that's born that way, and I've seen dogs that have those 2 spots, have 4 eyes. And so they have the ability to have kind of mystic vision, to see things beyond us. By the way, I have to tell you this because my friend Lance and I are both saying this to the audiences we saw through the week. Most people in this culture live in the normal world. Native people live in the paranormal. The paranormal is normal to us. The things that are inexplicable, we don't have to explain them, but they happen. They occur. The idea that things happen in a certain way, and you may be given a sign or a gift by the natural world. Accept it. One of my picture books for kids was written because a friend of mine had died. He said, "Don't worry, Joseph, you'll see me again. You'll see a little fox." And I was walking through the forest, and a fox came out, sat down in front of me, and just looked up at me. And I sang in a song, and it nodded, went back into the forest. I ended up writing a picture book called Fox, which is based on that experience, which I accepted and had no need to explain. Any final questions? I know it's now 7 o'clock.
I just have a little follow-up on what you were saying about rewriting. Many years ago, I heard an interview, I can't remember the author, they had asked him about how he did his writing, and he gave some advice that write hot, revise cold.
That's right.
Which I think meant to put it away.
Yeah.
And then go back to it.
Exactly. Let it cool off. Let heat stay with you, because the heat is, you really are following. Heat, by the way, is a powerful phenomenon. Heat is connected to life and light. The sun, our bodies hold the sun, hold light, hold life. That's an Vedic concept. It's true. Whether you believe it or not, it's true. And that idea of, I remember Galway Cannell, another American poet who was a good friend of mine. And Galway had this habit of, he'd do a poetry reading with a pen in hand. And when he's reading his new poems, he's like, as he's reading, he's crossing out words and writing other words in. Just at the moment, reading it aloud to an audience, which is just so cool. I thought, wow. And Galway said, yeah, just always be ready to let the poem tell you what it should be doing.
I was doing that the other night.
Yeah,
How do you write? Do you carry around a notepad and then go to a computer screen or use a typewriter? Or what are your methods?
I've done everything. I've
Yeah.
kept journals. I lived in Africa for 3 years in Ghana as a teacher. I kept journals every day and I go back to those journals and I do remember nothing about, May 1st, 1967. And open the journal and read what I wrote. And go, I remember that. In fact, more than I wrote comes back to me. So journals are great. I do that. I write in longhand. Actually, I print. But what I do, and I've written on a computer a lot as well. I wrote on a typewriter. Now I write on a computer, which is great because it frees me to write longer things and correct them and save things and move them aside for later, put something else in. It's great to be able to cut and paste.
Mhm.
But what I do these days for most of my writing is dictated into my phone. I walk with my dogs and I've actually got a book back there, which is called A Year of Moons. And it's nonfiction and every bit of it was written walking with my dogs during the pandemic, during the course of a year and dictating what I was seeing or remembering. And then I put it back into the computer and I'd go through and I'd revise it. But that idea is really important. I'm mentioning a lot of names because there's a lot of people I'm grateful to. One of them is a poet named Allen Ginsberg, who was a friend of mine. Allen was a wonderful guy. And Allen said to me one day, Joseph, nothing escapes faster than a poem in the night. Keep a notebook by your bed. And I keep my phone by the bed now. I turn it on. In the morning, I have no recollection often of what I dictated, or the old days, what I wrote. But that is really important because you have dreams, you have ideas. And believe me, you're not going to remember them at 11 o'clock in the morning, whatever. In fact, you might say, oh, I had this great dream. But if you write it down, it's there with you. And dreams are very meaningful things. When I was in the Yucatan with my son Jesse in the village of Naha, a Mayan village, the village elder, Chan Quin Viejo, 120 years old, every morning we had to tell him our dreams. And then he would, and it was interpreted into the Mayan language, of course, for it. Then he would tell us the meaning of our dreams in Mayan and translated it back to English. And it was very powerful, that experience. And often those things he interpreted literally did come true. So power and the importance of dreaming. And I think a lot of this too was dreamed. I remember waking up mornings knowing where my character was going and turning on my computer and beginning to write, follow the place he was going.
I have a question for you. Can you tell me more about the Slovak book? I'm interested in that. I have Slovak ancestry.
Yeah, actually, my family's from Trnava, Slovakia. And I wrote a novel called Dragon Castle, which is based on traditional Slovak stories
Oh,
taking place in the
do
Middle
you
Ages.
have that here?
I don't think so.
I do not,
Dragon
but we can-
Castle.
Track it down.
And I actually wrote a novel called Jocko and the Giant, which was serialized in American newspapers, but never published as a book, again, based on traditional stories. And I've written any number of poems about that side of my family. In fact, one of the terms for Slovakia is the land of song, because there are so many songs and stories that come out of Slovakia. Slovakia was known for its intellect, known for the brilliant writers that were connected. Franz Kafka was connected to Slovakia. So I have a very strong place in my heart for Slovakia. I've had my work translated into Slovak and Czech. And on 3 occasions, I tried to visit Slovakia, and every time I was thwarted. The first was when I was teaching in Ghana. I was going to go home in the summer of '68 by way of Slovakia. My wife and I were going to spend the summer there. It was, the Prague spring, and the Russians invaded. So we couldn't go to Slovakia. The second time was when I was in Germany. I was being sponsored by the U.S. Information Service to tour Germany, read college at Liz universities. I even went to Easter. It's followed everywhere. But we were going to go to Slovakia, but they closed the friggin' borders. Because they said there was unrest, and a week after I got back home, the Berlin Wall came down.
Oh,
So I did go to Slovakia that time. Third time. I was invited by the Czechoslovakia government to put together a tour of native writers and musicians. And we would tour Czechoslovakia. And it was also co-sponsored by the State Department. And I began pulling together this list of writers and storytellers, musicians. And then Slovakia broke into two countries and all the artist money disappeared. So I didn't go then either.
I'm going in September.
Oh, wonderful.
Nothing like that happening.
Well, there is a grave just outside of Prague, which has the name Joseph Bruchac on it.
Oh, it does.
You know, died in 1912. So I know it wasn't me. But I have a postcard with that picture of that grave on it. Yeah, it's Slovak tradition, folklore is wonderful. It's very deep.
Connie, could you order that?
Yeah, I'm gonna make a note to search.
Dragon
for
Castle.
Dragon Castle.
And if you can't find one, I have copies.
Okay.
But it is still in print. It's
Okay.
done by Dial Books.
Oh,
One of my major
Yeah,
publishers.
great.
Okay, well, any final questions? So what's your Slovak thing?
Bepco, Gatus, Hanzelko,
Yep,
from the High Tartars areas, and in the town is Humrose.
yeah, see, we're in the foothills of the top. of it.
Okay, so it's probably near Humrose and Slavic,
Not far from Turnover.
Turnabout. I'll have to look that up.
TRNAVA Turnover.
Okay, and I'm going on a tour, which I don't usually do, but it's a heritage tour. And they're gonna take me, I'm going myself, and they're gonna take me with an interpreter to the homeland village where my great grandparents came
Yes,
from,
great.
and we still have distant cousins there, and I had people visit 20 years ago. You talk about a state visit, my cousin, who was a rear admiral in the Navy, went in an official state visit.
Oh, yeah.
They paved the road for him coming,
That's-
and there's a video of the whole town, maybe 400 people out there singing.
Well, one of my
Yes, yeah.
translators was the wife of the Czechoslovakian ambassador to Canada.
Oh.
They came to visit us, the ambassador and his wife was my translator visiting me. And I'll tell you, I have had relatives of mine, like my aunt and uncle. They made a tour of Czechoslovakia, Slovakia in particular. They were welcomed with open arms. People were said, "Welcome home, welcome home." And they were just treated so well. Maybe someday, but I'm busy with something. This life here is hard to break away, but I still feel like part of my heart.
Well, I'm gonna travel around my own for a bit too,
Good for
for
you.
another couple of weeks after the tour.
Well, the like the national park, you know, the high Tatras, one of the country all the pictures I've seen, what people have told me. And there's at least one bear in Slovakia,
Yeah, I know.
at least one.
Oh, I just saw a video of one like in a town,
Yeah,
yeah,
the brown bears have come back within the last 30 years.
like running through Main Street of Cambridge.
Bears are here. We have them in our backyard, so like, well, I'll take in the feeders. Say, okay, Barry, sorry, you're not getting this. I got Barry, I got Bernice. Videos of it, so looking at me. Well, thank you for listening to me this evening. Trout.
Would you sign a copy for me
I-
of the book that you have, I think